Hjärtligt välkomna. Varsågod och stig på. Jag tar det här inledande på svenska och sen övergår vi till engelska för våra styrelserepresentanter från systerföreningen i Norden som är här för deras skull. Men jag som ordförande för RTVD, Raul Sjöqvist heter jag, vill bjuda er alla hjärtligt välkomna till den här öppna föreläsningen om dödshjälp. Henrik Ahlenius som var huvudsekreterare för rapporten SMER 2024:4, dödshjälp i en internationell utblick, ska hålla en föreläsning om just det internationella perspektivet. Sen efter föreläsningen så är ni hjärtligt välkomna att fika med oss och även prata med oss och de andra från de nordiska föreningarna och kanske också ställa frågor till Henrik. Så jag bjuder hjärtligt välkommen Henrik.
Tack så jättemycket. All right.
Vill du säga ett par ord, Rolf?
Det kan jag göra. Jag heter Rolf Franzén, jag är vice ordförande. Och jag har väl varit den som mest lagt upp det här. Det är en fin tradition vi har vid det här laget. It's a nice tradition. I turn to English now. It's a tradition that we have established to meet our Nordic friends every year. So we've turned around. We were last year in Finland. And now we are here. And it's very nice to see you here. And particularly our Nordic friends. And also, of course, Henrik, it's very nice that you could come this afternoon, and I give the word to you.
Tack så jättemycket. Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to come here and speak to you guys. And my background is in ethics or moral philosophy, but now I'm more of, I guess, a state bureaucrat philosopher, investigator, working for the Swedish National Council on Medical Ethics. And they have, of course, monitored and surveyed and made contributions to the assisted dying debate for many years. They did a knowledge overview 2017, sort of with all of the existing legal frameworks that exist in the world and all of the various arguments that you see in the debate and sort of describing them and to some extent evaluating those arguments. But then lots of things happened in the last couple of 5, 6, 7 years, so they thought we'd produce a kind of a companion sister volume to make the sort of existing state of knowledge view more complete. So that was something that I was mainly responsible for doing last year. It exists in printed form in Swedish, and it's also translated to English, but then only as a web file. You can find it on their webpage smer.se. SMER stands for Statens medicinsk-etiska råd. Actually, there's a kind of a jubileum this year. SMER, or this council, was founded in 1985, which makes it the world's second oldest bioethics or medical ethics council in the world, just after France had founded a similar one a couple of years ahead of Sweden. It was sort of triggered by, first, I guess, inspiration from the French model, and also some rapid developments in medicine about assisted reproduction, the concept of brain death, and so on. So there was a kind of a realization that a lot of interesting and difficult medical ethics topics were on the horizon, and that there should be a kind of a sector within this society or government that surveys and assesses these matters from ethical, scientific, existential points of view. This report, as the previous one, is sort of ethically neutral. It doesn't sort of suggest that Sweden should legalize or not legalize assisted dying in any form. It just sort of surveys the legal frameworks that exist and describes what kinds of reasons or arguments have appeared in the debate. And I think it's fair to say that the current setup of the council is sort of agnostic about the issue, so there would be some council members that are positive towards a possible legalization in Sweden, some that would be, I think, negative, and some who are hesitant about the matter. In a previous iteration of the council, they had more positively suggested that Sweden should at least sort of make some kind of inquiry into legalizing self-administered assisted dying. But I don't think the current council sort of feels bound by that statement, and they are not actively working towards that end. And yeah, it's the Swedish council. I'm not sure it's unique, but at least uncommon, possibly unique in that many countries have some sort of bioethics councils, but most of them consist solely of experts in medicine, ethics, theology, and so on. And the Swedish one has this sort of hybrid form where representatives of the people, together with these kinds of experts, work together. So each party with some representation in the parliament has one representative in the council. That makes for 8 people who are not necessarily parliamentarians, but sort of working for that parliamentarian party, together with a group of experts. So the purpose or content of this report, as I said, was to make a more complete picture, given a more ambitious project, you might say, that we had in 2017. And to briefly, not really assess or evaluate, but sort of briefly sketch what kinds of arguments are out there that would be brought to bear on various models for assisted dying. And to just make sure that sort of debate and conversation in Sweden, and to the extent that it's read internationally, sort of stays well informed and matter-of-factly. Right? And as I said, it doesn't really provide a kind of a suggestion for what we should do or anything like that. So one thing that, of course, we had to start with is the matter of sort of vocabulary. I think over the years there's been different ideas about sort of what to call this phenomenon. There's this word euthanasia, euthanasia. So for some, as you know, of course, it has a kind of a connotation which sounds bad for many. I was a little bit surprised in a sense when I was sort of assigned to this job that it was the suggested term for Swedish use. For me personally, I thought it was like a kind of a dead concept, kidnapped by sort of the Nazi movement. But the council sort of suggests that it can be used in a neutral way. And I also think there was perhaps a will not to create a kind of a euphemism that would make it sound good in and of itself. So let's use this word which has sort of positive and negative connotations, i.e. sort of cancel it out. So the Swedish version for a procedure where the patient is helped to die, helped by healthcare staff, typically a physician, but it could be a nurse, for instance, would be called euthanasia or euthanasia in Swedish. And some other European countries uses that term too, the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on. In France, they don't seem to like that word, so they would use aide à mourir, help to die, sort of more similar to the Swedish word, perhaps. And most English-speaking countries seem to prefer assisted dying or medical assistance in dying and so on. So for the English translation, I chose that we would use assisted dying as sort of the umbrella term, and it comes in 2 forms, either patient-administered or practitioner-administered, right? Or self-administered or patient-administered. So those are the 2 forms. It creates a little bit of a confusion perhaps for Swedes, because our council suggested that when we're speaking about self-administered, we call it assisterat döende, which sort of loops back to this umbrella term, assisted dying. So one has to be a little bit aware of the usages. But assisted dying comes in 2 forms, either performed by someone from the healthcare staff, practitioner administered, or by the patient themselves. Probably, as you know, if a society allows for practitioner administration, they also allows for self-administration, not necessarily slow. For instance, Quebec, in the province in Canada, it only allows for practitioner administration. But to the left here is a list of the countries that allow for at least some form of practitioner administration, or euthanasia, as you may call it. Australia, Belgium, Canada, Colombia, Ecuador, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand. Portugal has adopted a law, but it hasn't, as far as I know, quite yet been sort of rolled out into implementation, and Spain. And when it comes to self-administered assisted dying, Switzerland, as you know, 10 or a dozen or so states in the US. Austria, pretty recently, a couple of years ago, have legalized it. Italy and Germany, I think, can be on this list, but they haven't had a kind of a parliamentary positive legalization, but more a statement that it is not to be thought of as a criminal act if doctors assist in this. And probably they will come more more positive legalization regulating, saying not only why it is not forbidden, but under what conditions it's to be allowed. So there are different ideas and models out there. I guess some common feature, of course, would emphasize that this is a voluntary thing. It's something that patients must request, and can only be done if they wish for it, of course, and that they have full decision-making capacity, at least when they make the request and undergo a kind of an eligibility assessment. That people agree, doctors agree, that there's nothing we can do reasonably towards alleviating this condition. And of course, that it's not a kind of a contractual thing, but you can change your mind at any point and say, I changed my mind, I no longer request assisted dying. That it is not to be thought of as sort of opting out or an alternative to palliative care. It's something that you can have at the same time. All legislations that allow for assisted dying have made some kind of arrangements for there to be so-called conscientious objections, so that healthcare staff who feel that they do not wish to work with these kinds of patients or issues cannot be forced to do that. But it's been done in different ways. You can say that some are sort of more allow for more conscientious objection than others, perhaps. There are, of course, differences that are interesting to consider, and if you say that you are in favor of assisted dying, still that leaves out many details to consider. What kinds of legal frameworks would I like to see implemented, given that I have this general acceptance of assisted dying, or the reverse, of course. For those who are against assisted dying, it comes in many forms, and you can be skeptical of some and less skeptical of others, perhaps. So one sort of big division seems to be this between self-administer versus practitioner-administer. And I guess it's sort of generally thought that the self-administered version is sort of more or less controversial. That it's typical that some societies only legalize that, but have not legalized practitioner-administer. Whereas sort of the reverse seems to be that if you've legalized practitioner administration or euthanasia, you would also allow self-administration. Though in practice it may be very uncommon with self-administration in some cultures and countries. Some countries have a kind of a prohibition against the healthcare staff bringing up the topic, whereas others say it's something that doctors can inform patients that this is one of many options and so on. So some states in Australia, for instance, have made it prohibited for doctors to sort of be the first people who mentions it. A big difference might be this possibility of, so everyone agrees that patient needs to be competent for applying or requesting assisted dying, but not all agree that you must be fully competent at the time when you receive the assisted dying. In some countries, Spain, Belgium, and so on, you can make a kind of an advance directives that if I were to lose my full competence and I could no longer sort of reapply, this is my last competent verdict that I would still want it. Of course, you can change your mind if the sort of more later non-competent person no longer wishes for it. They will not have it by force or anything like that, but it's not a necessary requirement that they must remain fully competent throughout. Whereas, say, Australia and New Zealand, who recently legalized, had made it restricted to those who remain competent throughout. Another big difference is those countries that allow for assisted dying to a patient group who is close to death. So it could be 6 or maybe 12 months sort of expected remaining lifetime. And those who say that in addition to those patients, patients who have some chronic disease that is impossible to alleviate and which they may live with for years and years, may also be eligible. Whether or not you would demand that you must be 18 or adult, or if you could be a younger person to request it, is also different. Another big point of debate, of course, is if this is only relevant for those societies that do allow for chronic diseases and not lethal diseases, that if you would also, at least in principle, include mental suffering or psychiatric disorders. Some do, some don't. And as I said, sort of the scope and design of conscientious objection. So for instance, Spain, they have a kind of opt-out system. So it's assumed that healthcare staff would be able and willing to work with assisted dying matters, but they can opt out and say, I don't wish to have ever encountered those kinds of patients or issues. But the starting assumption is that you have to do something to not work with those kinds of matters. Other countries have sort of the opposite, a kind of opt-in approach, where you perhaps have to signal a willingness to work with those kinds of issues and patients, and perhaps also take classes or courses to do that. So depending on how you design those things, you could have a very big portion or a smaller portion of healthcare staff that are involved in these kinds of matters. I highlighted these in yellow because I think they're particularly perhaps ethically interesting to consider, whether or not we think this division between self and practitioner administration is that crucial, and this other issue of terminal versus any chronic kind of patient group. For me, this was a news, maybe it's a given old news for you guys, that I think these different legislations do allow for possibility of comparing what do patients prefer. And it seems that patients, when given the choice, prefer practitioner administration, i.e. euthanasia. So in New Zealand, for instance, they have a system where patients request and are assessed for their assisted dying, and if you are sort of classified as eligible, the patient is given the choice, open choice, between self or practitioner administration. And 93% chooses practitioner administration. In Victoria and South Australia, sort of the more, you might say, restrictive or conservative versions of the Australian models, there's a condition that only patients who are physically incapable of self-administration may receive practitioner administration. So sort of the default is that patients administer the substance themselves, and only if you are unable to may you be assisted. So there you can see sort of the objective proportion is that 15% only are assessed as being incapable of doing it themselves. And then these intermediary Australian state, Queensland and Western Australia, have sort of more or less liberty. And you can see sort of the more liberty there is, or the less of a kind of a default there is, patients prefer doctor administration or practitioner administration. I'll show you now, assuming that the technique works, a kind of a brief information film from the healthcare boards or authorities in the state of South Australia, just to see how sort of citizens were presented with this new option in society. Maybe at what we in Sweden would call the anslagstavla on Swedish TV. Right. Sorry if the volume was too high. So all Australian states have this condition that it's solely for terminal patients, but there are some differences. So he used the word, it is advised that doctors refer you to another doctor if they are not participating, and in other states it could be that it's mandatory that you do it, and so on. So that's an example of sort of the differences in sort of the level of freedom that doctors are allowed to have under the system. So in some legislations they may just say, I'm not going to help you with that, and no further sort of information or referral is done. In others, they must perhaps provide contact details for information to the patients. So here's from Australia. I would guess it's pretty global, sort of what kinds of reasons people give for requesting assisted dying. As you see, it comes to more than 100, so people can provide several reasons for why they have requested assisted dying. That I'm less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable was the most common reason, that simply my quality of life is unacceptable at this point. Loss of autonomy, loss of dignity, inadequate pain control. I should say that actually there was inadequate pain control or fear thereof, or loss of dignity or fear thereof. So it could be patients who actually have not actually experienced inadequate pain control, but fear that may happen. So that remains to sort of be investigated, to what extent those fears were really realistic. All right, you guys are the experts here, so what's happening in our Nordic countries? As many of you know, there was a governmental inquiry in Denmark into looking into the end-of-life care, including considering assisted dying in various forms. And a majority view within this inquiry was that Denmark may proceed with at least self-administered assisted dying, and I think a smaller but still a majority thought that also practitioner administration could be legalized. It's been a couple of months now, and it's been silent for a while. You said that just the other day a kind of a new investigation was launched again, so things are starting perhaps to remove, but there's been debate, of course, in Danish society, but there's no bill or anything like that in parliament quite yet. I don't think Sweden has this system. From what I've read, I've sort of seen it both in Denmark and Finland, that private citizens may present an issue to the parliament, and if there are enough signatories, parliament have to sort of deal with the issue. And that's happened both in Denmark and Finland on this matter. Sweden, there is nothing concretely going on at the legal level. As you know, it's something that sort of exists as a permanent debate in society. Some parties are officially more positive towards making some kind of inquiry, possibly legalizing it, and others are less enthusiastic about that, of course. Finland has made inquiries into this, but there's nothing concretely going on right now. They had sort of sketched two kinds of models. One more, you might say, sort of conservative, where the legal permission would only cover terminal illnesses and self-administration. Perhaps sort of similar to sort of the US Oregon model or something like that. And another more sort of permissive, a sketch of a more permissive possible system with including practitioner administration. In other countries in Europe, things are happening. I hadn't quite realized, I must confess, how sort of fragmented in a sense the UK is. So it may be that different parts of the kingdom will legalize and legalize in different ways. So there's this bill that is sort of covering Scotland and England, which is for terminal illnesses and self-administration. So that is sort of going through the system right now, and it looks as it will probably be legalized, but there's no, of course, guarantee for that. I think other parts, so there are these Channel Islands and so on, have had their own legislations, and possibly also including practitioner administration. On Ireland, there was a governmental inquiry into this, a parliamentary inquiry, which was sort of landed in a sort of a positive conclusion towards legalizing. So that is under debate and sort of reconsideration there. France was in a sense closer a year or so back to moving towards legalizing, and then there was this cabinet crisis or something of the sort, so all of these sort of legal motions that were set in play were nullified and sort of had to restart. But Macron and others he was sort of behind it, a legalization. It would be similar to what you could call the Australian model, where there's a condition of only terminal illnesses and a kind of default in favor of self-administration, but an allowance for practitioner administration if the patient is unable to do it. This followed in an interesting way a so-called citizens' council or something of the sort. So they had randomly selected representative citizens of France who had been given the opportunity to go to some conference center, for instance, and talk and interview and listen to debates and so on medical doctors, philosophers, legal scholars, and so on. So it was a way of sort of informing the government about how is this sort of handled or thought about by ordinary people. And these citizens' council had recommended that France should move towards legalizing. And actually, I think the sort of popular verdict would be to not make such a big difference between self and practitioner administration, but the current model is somewhat more restrictive or conservative in that regards. But still, it will not be, if legalized, will not exclude practitioner administration. There have been many cases in the European Court of Human Rights from individuals who take their country to court because they think they've been violated in not being granted assisted dying, or have seen a loved one die under horrible circumstances and think that they were violated. So the premise of their case has been that it's incompatible with our human rights, that we are not entitled to assisted dying. But the court has always sort of rejected those kinds of cases and saying the Charter of Rights under the European understanding here does not include a positive right to assistance in dying. But they haven't said so much about countries that actually do allow for assistance to dying. And there was a Belgian man who brought Belgium to court because he said that it had failed to protect his vulnerable mother who had been given assisted dying. And he and others of his siblings were just informed one day that their elderly mother had died this way, and they hadn't been informed. And she had applied under sort of this possibility of mental illness and mental suffering. So that sort of forced the court to consider whether or not she had been violated, or whether or not her vulnerability hadn't been thoroughly examined or protected. But they actually found that Belgium's system was an acceptable system, and they had said that doctors had, of course, tried to convince this person that she should contact her relatives and that they may help her and so on. But she had refused to do so, and given that statement of hers, doctors were prevented from violating her wish this way. So they had taken reasonable steps towards making her reach out to her family. And they said that sort of these are like the basic skeletons that need to be in place for any assisted dying scheme to be compatible with basic human rights. First, that there's an official clear criteria that are required, so people can know, given these criteria, a person may be eligible, and only under these criteria, for requesting and having assisted dying. That the procedure guarantees that voluntariness sort of remains safeguarded, and that the society ensures that there are special protections needed for vulnerable groups and individuals, and that the steps and assessment that healthcare staff or any person asked to sort of consider cases, that they are properly described and sort of thoroughly understandable. And they found that Belgium did satisfy these conditions. They had other criticism about how they assess in hindsight cases. For instance, they had feared that doctors who were involved in assisted dying could be targeted in public and sort of their home address made official and so on. So their system was that people who had worked or been the responsible doctors were anonymized. And that had in turn led to sometimes people who were assessing the cases were also people involved in the cases. So the court said that cannot be a proper system. But it wasn't really the thing that the relatives had complained about. So one issue that is often brought up, of course, is that assisted dying is a kind of a threat to the idea that all people are equal in value and worth and dignity, and that assisted dying is a kind of signal to people with disability that they are not. I think there are many, of course, disability organizations and so on with different sort of verdicts and ideas. But I think it's fair that sort of the typical stance from these organizations is that they are critical or against assisted dying. The current debate in UK, their Disability Rights UK, they have opposed this suggested bill. But I also read that people with disabilities, there's far from a consensus on this. So here's an excerpt from one of the governmental hearings that were with a person speaking of his disability. He said, we ask you to remember that disabled people are a diverse community of individuals with rich life experiences that encompass and surpass our identity as disabled people. Yet in this debate, as sadly happens in many areas of our lives, we are too often spoken over. So one shouldn't assume that people with disabilities would be against it. It varies. All right. As you probably know, there's a kind of a trend that once a society legalizes assisted dying, it becomes more common and a higher sort of proportion of people die by that method. Sometimes it may perhaps look very dramatic, but so Canada is approaching the Netherlands, and I'm not sure it's fair to say it's sort of plateauing, but the sort of increase is very, very slow, around 5% of every person dying. So every 20th death is a death by assisted dying. And that's been the case in Canada from the legislation to where it was, to where we are last year. These little red added blocks there refer to the proportion of people dying by medical assistance that were chronic patients but not terminal patients. So that was not allowed in the first parts, during the first parts of legislation, but then became legal. And as you can see, it's a very tiny fraction still. So most people who die by assisted dying have a terminal disease in Canada, and that's true for the Netherlands and Belgium as well. All right, why do we see this trend? Why? So first, sort of an increase of assisted dying in countries that legalizing, and also a trend towards more country legalizing or considering legalizing. This is a bit speculative, but I think these are fair assessments. So there is a growing emphasis in society and in healthcare on autonomy or self-determination. So we have less of a kind of authoritarian, reliant societies where we do as the doctors say, and people expect to have more of a say in how they are treated. It's a bit of a surprise if you would take a guess in 1990 said, do you think that Spain and Italy will have assisted dying before Denmark and Sweden? I think many people would not guess that, but that's what happened. And it's surprising given that you could say it seems that the role of religion and sort of the religious authority of ethical discussions is somewhat stronger in those countries, and also the content of that ethos is much more skeptical of or critical of or dismissive of assisted dying. Still, in Spain and Italy and Portugal and so on, France, people are either legalizing or considering this. So it's a kind of a battle of wills over the sort of intellectual authority in ethical debates where the church has lost out on some of its authority. Another kind of very interesting reason is that this is something that sort of is the result of a, in a way, positive development where we get much better at keeping people alive. So 100 years ago, people just fell down dead and there wasn't much you could do about it. But now most people die under sort of prolonged conditions. If you die, you're likely to have been in hospital for a year already, perhaps. So that means that dying is intertwined with a lot of decisions and considerations about what is worth doing, what is likely to happen, what kinds of outcomes are satisfactory for the patient, and so on. So already those kinds of you can say ethics appears when there are choices, and there are so many much more choices these days than there used to be. So ethics is sort of bound to appear. Dying becomes sort of impregnated with ethical considerations. Also, I think people, of course, debate the sort of wisdom and acceptability of all of the legal systems that are out there. But by and large, it seems fair to say that countries that have legalized are sort of satisfied with that move. And if anything, there's a kind of a tendency to make more permissive standards. So more states in the US seem to be considering it, and the kinds of restrictive factors that were built into are being loosened up somewhat. So for instance, it used to be that if you were judged eligible for self-administered assisted dying, there would be like a 48-hour waiting period before you could get that medicine to make sure that you're not doing something too hastily. But of course, that could have bad side effects. Of course, you could be suffering immensely and so on. So in many states, they've decided, let's make that waiting period shorter or remove it. So there's a tendency to sort of allow for more personal liberty in all of these cases. Also, although has always been a kind of a mismatch, you might say, if you compare sort of the popular view and the views of medical doctors. So doctors tend to be somewhat more skeptical of legalizing assisted dying. People debate why is it that kind of mismatch, but it's a fact that there is a difference of opinion. But if anything, the move seems to be that doctors too are becoming more accepting. I'm not sure if it's been investigated, if it's because people changed their minds, or rather that there's a kind of revolution of younger doctors replacing older doctors, and they have different views. That would be my guess. So younger doctors are less dismissive of the possibility of legalizing, and as older doctors go into retirement, that will be a change. A kind of significant, I think, illustration was that in the first parliamentary hearing in Australia in the state of Victoria, the representative of Victoria's physicians said that our organization is against this move. We do not wish for there to be legalized assisted dying. A couple of years later, in some other state, maybe it was Queensland, a kind of the similar person for physicians in Queensland was there, and they said, we think that this is a political question, not something for doctors to decide over. So they hadn't become more perhaps positive necessarily, but sort of thought that it's not for something that the doctors' guilds should sort of prevent or have a view on. It's something that people can decide themselves, or that politicians representing people can decide. I made this map. It exists in English too on the council's webpage. To sort of it would be nicer if I could only have used two colors. It's possible here and not possible there, but there are so many versions of sort of having or allowing for assisted dying. So it could be allowed by a kind of a positive legislation that the parliaments in these countries have adopted, or could have been made decriminalized, as we called it, through a verdict of the Supreme Courts. Some of the countries here, what color was that? It's a kind of turquoise, perhaps, colors, like Mexico and France, sort of to just signify things are moving here, but nothing is quite yet done. Now, this map is 2 years old, and perhaps you could say that France is no longer is different now than it is from Mexico, so things have advanced. So the map should be updated, you might say, because things are happening. But generally speaking, the map is still accurate. And here describes the various criteria and so on that are in place. All right, thank you so much. Thanks.